You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World, conversations with researchers and the paths they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hello, I'm Dr Humera Iqbal, and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the Thomas Coram Research Unit at the UCL Institute of Education. On this episode, we're delighted to have Dr Guy Roberts-Holmes, who's an associate professor here at the UCL Institute of Education. He's based at the Department for Learning and Leadership. Before he came to academia, he worked as a primary and early years teacher for quite some time in central London. His research is about the governance of schools through accountability. Today, we're going to talk to Guy about the challenges of baseline assessment. Guy, hello, how are you doing?
Hi, Humera. Good, thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me.
As I mentioned before, today we're going to talk about reception baseline assessment. So, can you tell us what that is?
Firstly, reception baseline assessment is actually not assessment at all. It is actually an accountability measure. So it should be called reception baseline accountability because assessment is to do with children's learning. Assessment is a central activity of teachers' work. Accountability, however, is something very, very different. So it's important to realize that this reception baseline is actually a test for 4-year-old children. It is not concerned with children's care, holistic and development. It is rather a numerical accountability measure, which is going to be used to judge early years and primary school teachers' performance. It is going to be an accountability measure that the government is trying to establish in September 2020, a baseline from which to then measure progress of children across 7 years of primary school. So the baseline, they want to create a starting place from which to then measure the progress of children across their entire 7 years to year 6.
It's a really, really important measure then that's going to impact on their entire early years of their lives.
That is absolutely correct. So this is a very calculated piece of policy that it is fundamentally about, as I say, accountability, not trusting teachers, but rather holding them to account against a numerical statistic. Colleagues who've done lots of research around the validity of measuring a 4-year-old and then 7 years later measuring that child when they're 11 and comparing children, teachers and schools have said that this is statistically a flawed measure because of the wide variety of contextual variables that a child between the age of 4 and 11 will go through, all sorts of family changes. The school also has enormous changes. So as an accountability measure of progress, it cannot do its statistical job. And colleagues such as Professor Harvey Goldsmith and other statisticians have shown that.
So, Guy, when you say that, it's a measure for 4-year-olds, and then what do you mean by that? What kind of things are in this kind of assessment or test then? What kind of things are children asked?
When they first come into their reception class in the first 6 weeks, which is their settling in period, when they're trying to build up relationships, they will be taken out of the classroom and sat in front of a computer with a teacher. The teacher then reads a tightly worded script, which is pre-programmed and written, and the children are asked formal school-based questions around literacy and phonics and early numeracy. They will then get an aggregate score from this half-hour test. Each child takes the test for roughly 20 to 30 minutes. They will then get a number. A single number will then be entered into the pupil national database for that child, and then an aggregate score will be collated for the class. Then the theory is that 7 years on, in 2027, those same children will be tested. They haven't yet worked out what kind of tests they will have in year 6, but the idea is to measure the progress of that cohort of those children who take the test in September 2020, and then compare it to other children in other schools. And the idea is to create competition between the schools in terms of data, which is supposed to fuel the school's market, the competitiveness between schools. So then parents are supposed to choose, which school performs the best. So it's another piece of the school's competitive schools market. That's the thinking behind this test for 4-year-olds.
You said that in September 2020, they're going to roll this out. Is that correct?
That currently is their plan. As I said, the test focuses on school-based phonics, literacy, and numeracy. However, given that we are sitting in the middle of a global pandemic, we know, and the government knows, that there are many young children who will simply come out of this pandemic and they will need good food, good healthy food to eat. Some of them will be traumatized from experience of domestic violence. Lots of families will be experiencing poverty, and there's lots of stress in families with young children at the present moment. So what a test to measure children's formal school-based maths and literacy is not appropriate. It's not appropriate at any time, but it's completely morally inappropriate in a context in which children need to build healthy relationships with their teacher. They need to build a healthy sense of themselves and as them as learners. So our research found out that unfortunately for too many children, they cannot do these formal tests. 4-year-olds are very emotionally literate, and they were very aware that they were being taken out of the classroom for a test. And they were aware when the teacher was marking on the tablet that they couldn't do certain things. So we had children that were looking down, looking away, saying, I can't read, I can't do this. When can I go out to play? Can I leave now? So the teachers were telling us, and our observations made us aware that for some children, particularly English as an additional language children, because the test can only be carried out in English, summer-born children who are younger in that age group, children who are disadvantaged, children with special educational needs, were really struggling with the test and knew that they weren't doing very well in the test. So the teachers were telling us that this was emotionally upsetting for some children and damaging their vulnerable sense of self-esteem and their self-confidence. And therefore the test really was not appropriate. And we conducted our tests, of course, last September 2019, before COVID-19. So given the change, we know that these children are going to be far more vulnerable.
I mean, absolutely. I just thinking of I've done work with children with EAL or it's English as a second language, and I think that's absolutely it's shocking that the test is not available in different languages, and it's almost as if you're setting up children for failure to some extent, and kind of not expecting that they'll be able to achieve particular goals or milestones. So I think your work's so important, Guy. It's really important that people are made aware of this.
Yes, completely right. But I can just quote from one of the teachers. What you just said is so true. She said to us, this is a reception class teacher, and I quote, I'm just angry because why should I be made to make a child fail? I'm now put in a position where I'm almost encouraged to make children fail and to make them feel bad about themselves. That's not why I'm a teacher. I actually would question my own teaching ability and whether I still wanted to do that, because I'm being made to make 30 children feel bad about themselves. So I think that you're quite right that children are being set up to fail by a test which does not listen to what they can do. Early years teachers are experts in listening to what young children can do. That is their professional expertise for which they're very carefully trained. And they carefully listen and document what young children can do, and they build on that experience that English as additional language children bring from their multilingual backgrounds and their multicultural backgrounds, and what all the different kinds of children bring to school. And they're experts at listening to this and then building on the child's learning on that with health professionals, with other teachers, with the parents, inclusive and cooperative ways. So all of the schools that we visited actually already carry out holistic baseline assessments, which are genuinely inclusive and collaborative with the parents, the communities. The teachers make home visits to find out what the children and families can do, and they build on that. So this government imposed numerical computer scripted test actually is the opposite of good early years practice.
Oh gosh, I mean, it's really, I hear what you're saying. And
Yeah.
I think evidence is incredibly important to further make this claim. And I want to go back to your research and I want to sort of ask you, like, how did you collect your data?
Mm.
And did you speak to any parents? And did you hear from parents and ask them about what they thought of all of this?
Well, yes. So with colleagues, we've carried out, there's been, obviously, this is quite a big policy shift. So there's a lot of research has gone into this over the last 4 years. The Department for Education have tried to impose baseline assessment back in 2016 when I carried out some research with my colleague Dr. Alice Bradbury. And subsequently, the government withdrew the baseline assessment because of the pressure from teachers who decided not to carry out this test and head teachers who withdrew their schools from the pilot in 2016. Subsequently, there's been research led, as I said, by Professor Harvey Goldstein and colleagues at the British Educational Research Association who've looked specifically at the statistical modelling and that it's not possible to compare or test accurately 4-year-olds because of so many variables. And then the most recent piece of research that we carried out was with Dr. Diana Sousa, Dr. Su Feng Li, and Dr. Emma Jones. And both the 2016 and the 2019 pieces of research have together drawn over 3,000 teacher responses, different teacher responses from schools. And in the two pieces of research, we've been into 15 case study schools and we've carried out interviews with head teachers, parents, and teachers, classroom teaching assistants, early years foundation stage leaders, and the parents, and we've carried out in-depth observations. So it's been thoroughly methodologically valid, our research. Many parents weren't aware of the test and what it would do, actually.
I mean, so once they became aware, did they have anything to say? I mean, did you find that some parents thought it was a good idea, or were most parents kind of, once they did find out about it, did it increase anxiety or worry?
Yeah, I mean, parents were not the focus of this most recent piece of research. I have to say, it was the 2016 research that we had a small group of parents involved. Parents we did interview in 2016
Mm.
said that they wanted
Mm.
the teacher to be there for the child and not the test. Many parents were unhappy that their children might get labeled when they were 4 years old, because other pieces of research at the Institute have shown how this ability grouping, which is used extensively in primary schools, is cascading down into the early years, into reception. So we're seeing younger and younger children put in groups in order to gain the highest percentage figures in national tests, such as the phonics test and Key Stage 1 tests, because schools are judged by these national standardized tests. So reception baseline assessment is yet another national standardized test, which is cascaded down to a 4-year-old who's literally just walked in the school door in the first 6 weeks of their school experience, which is called the settling in period. This is what the experts, who are the early years teachers, call it. They call it the settling in. That, in other words, that is when the teacher's building up positive, healthy relationships with the young children and their parents, having cups of tea and breakfast with the parents and the children, chatting with them. They're building on the home visits, getting the children to play, encouraging them to play, to socialize, and to feel confident in who they are in this entirely new environment with lots of new relationships to build. It's a really quite daunting experience for some 4-year-olds. So parents want their children to be happy, supported and safe in that context and cared for. That is what the parents told us they want. And of course, that is what the early years teachers are experts at doing, at listening to young children and building up their resilience, their confidence, their perseverance, healthy sets of relationships. And they take detailed notes and observations by watching the children play and seeing what the children can do. This is what we have heard parents want to do, and there's plenty of research which I can point out that actually what parents don't want is
Hmm.
lots of data about school performance and competitions between schools. This is something that actually parents are not so interested in, although the government keeps telling us that actually this is what parents want. But I think that we have to realize that the standardized testing in primary schools, which is
Hmm.
now being cascaded down to 4-year-olds with this reception baseline test, is political ideology that comes from a political right wing position that somehow competition is an excellent thing for 4-year-old children to be doing against each other. Many parents actually do not feel that.
It's almost like a baptism by fire. You're straight in and you're in with this test. And it does, I mean, I remember, I don't know about you, did you have many tests when you were at school? How did you feel about tests and exams when you were at school?
Well, when you're 4 years old, what you want to do is you want to please your teachers and you want to be included and accepted and feel that you're successful and wanted. The problem with a test for a 4-year-old is that many will feel a sense of failure. And that's what the young children were telling their teachers. I can't read. Why should a 4-year-old be able to read from a computer screen? Of course they can't. They need to learn to love stories, to love listening to stories. That's so much more important than being able
Mm.
to phonetically sound out and bark at print. It's much better that they are playing with their friends and feeling confident and have high sense of self-esteem. And as I say, this sense of failure, well, lots of research has shown how it stays with children throughout their school careers, this sense of failure. So we see children being put into ability groups. Possibly this may happen from this test, and they stay in those ability groups throughout their primary school and secondary school. All the research shows that that is what happens. And so that is why we are not seeing the educational gap disappearing between the advantaged and disadvantaged. If anything, this gap is widening. And under the context of COVID-19, in which disadvantaged children will come to school even more severely disadvantaged compared to their more advantaged peer group, we will see this gap widening, and the test will simply exacerbate that and create more difficulties.
I absolutely hear you. It's once you're in the box, it's really hard to get out of the box. And I think that,
Yeah.
as you said, it's also totally tied into social class and ethnicity,
Mm,
and
mm,
it's kind of correlated. It's linked to so many other factors.
exactly.
So I really hear you, and it's quite heartbreaking to think that a 4-year-old thinks that they're a failure when they're just starting out life. Really, just coming back to your research though, and you talked about working with the case study schools. I mean, were there any schools that really stood out and kind of really shaped your research? And are there any schools that you'd like to share stories about?
There were 3 researchers involved in going into the latest case study schools. We chose schools where the head teachers had decided not to trial the baseline assessment, and we interviewed those head teachers and teachers, and that was very interesting. So we had 3 schools that had chosen not to carry out baseline assessment, and we had 3 schools where they had chosen to carry out baseline assessment. Some of the schools had very high levels of English as additional language children, and the children were not able to do the test, but nonetheless, the teacher was at emotional pains to try to make children feel as if they had done something, although she knew that they weren't able to engage in the test because it was in English. And for some of these children, they'd never been in a formal school setting before. So we went into some schools which were in more advantaged areas and some schools that were in more disadvantaged areas. And my colleagues, Dr. Su Feng Li and Dr. Diana Sousa, they carried out a lot of the in-depth observational work. And one of the things that they found was that reception teachers are actually having to leave their classrooms and then sit in the corridor because you need a quiet space with the child and the computer. So reception class teachers were being taken out away from their primary role, which is to socialize, care, and build up the relationships with their young children. And they were sitting in the corridor with the computer and one child for up to half an hour. This meant the teaching assistant was then in charge on her own, often it was a woman, on her own with the class of 30 new children, or 29 new children because one had been taken out. We also found schools where teachers were drafted down into reception and out of their own classrooms in order to enable the reception class teacher to sit in the corridor. None of this is good early years practice, but it was the only way that the teachers could perform this test. What they want to do, early years teachers, is build dialogue with a child, listening to the child and having a meaningful relationship with the child. Many of the early years classroom teachers, they told us that because you have 30 children taking up a 20 to 30-minute test, this equates to roughly 2 weeks of work sitting in the corridor.
That sounds like an awful lot of stress. I mean, it's so interesting. This one assessment is completely thrown everything, up. And it's not only by the sense of it. So it's not just the children, it's the teachers. And then also, I imagine the head teachers kind of worrying about staff and bringing in new teachers and then the teaching assistants. So
Yeah.
it just sounds like this test is impacting so many in so many different ways.
That's a really good point because actually some head teachers employed supply teachers. And again, we know that schools are under very tight financial constraints, so having to buy in extra teachers. But not all schools could do that, which is why you had movement of teachers around the school to cover the reception class where they could. There were 5,000 schools which did not participate in the trial. The trial was voluntary. And actually, I have to say, they were very brave and courageous because in the context of a fierce schools accountability and schools market situation where schools rise or fall on Ofsted grades, to say actually, no, we're going to take a moral position around this and an ethical position, and we're not going to test 4-year-olds because we don't think it's educationally valuable and or appropriate. So we're constantly told that the government is listening to its experts within the context of COVID-19, which of course it should be doing. So it would be great if it also listened to the early years experts at this point and realised that a numerical measurement is not only flawed, but it's also politically and ethically inappropriate in this context. All of the early years experts and professional organisations are saying what children need at the moment when they are allowed to return to school is healthy food, secure sets of relationships, lots of time and space to build up their self-confidence, because these young children have been in isolation and not able to develop what is a very normal and healthy approach to their young lives.
As a psychologist, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that, there's definitely going to be trauma, for society as a whole as a result of this. And, there will be children who's, have been impacted directly, losing members and of their family or people they love because of the pandemic. So I really hear you. And I think it's such an important point. And
some young children will have been traumatized in ways, and therefore, this is what the experts are saying. So, social care in the early years therefore becomes absolutely the professional key responsibilities of teachers, and it is not a DFE numerical test which is needed now.
but Guy, what would you say would be preferable to reception baseline assessment?
Early years teachers already carry out detailed holistic tests, assessments of children for learning. So they already, through careful observations and home visits and talking with children, they already have a very good awareness of what the literacy and numeracy of these young children bring to school. And this is known as the child's early learning story, through documentation that's carefully collected, through a wide variety of activities such as music, play, the art, painting, drawing, All sorts of activities that young children engage in day to day are carefully collated into booklets for the child and the parent to go through and see how the child is learning in many different curriculum activities. The problem with standardized testing, such as baseline assessment, is it reduces all of that holistic arts-based learning to simply phonics and numeracy.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think you're absolutely spot on there. And it's been just so wonderful talking to you today, Guy, and kind of hearing more about your work and just really the importance and the fact that we need to make some changes really soon before, the next semester starts. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
You can follow our guest on Twitter at Guy Roberts-Holmes or go to the IOE website for more details. Remember, there are more podcasts from the IOE ready for you to listen to on our favourite podcasting app. Just search for IOE Podcast and have a listen to our Spotify playlist of our guest and podcast team's favourite hits to get you through the lockdown. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Humera Iqbal.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.